So just after I've started to build a computer, one of the first things I'll do is I'll check the voltage, 12 volt rail and the 5 volt rail and the 3.3 volt rail as well. In these settings it's showing me the 5 volt rail and the 12 volt rail, and these look pretty good. So normally expect the voltages to be slightly higher than the nominal. So here we've got 12.168 and 5.04. And what tends to happen is, as you're pulling load on the CPU and GPU, which are on the 12 volt rail, this voltage will drop slightly. You get a bit of voltage droop and it'll go down to around 12 volts, which is what you want. And that tends to happen on pretty much everything, unless you've got a digital power supply, in which case it should be 12 volts all the time. So what I'm doing now is I'm installing Windows onto this computer. I've just copied, been onto the Microsoft website and downloaded the bootable files for the USB stick. I've not changed any BIOS settings yet. Everything is standard, no XMP on or anything. And this is the best way of putting Windows on to start with. We can make changes after Windows is on. Got the front of the case off at the minute. I tend to put the front on after I've installed Windows and everything, and I've made sure everything's running correct. So one of the first programs that I install is the chipset driver for Ryzen. So you need to get that one from the AMD site, not the manufacturer of the motherboard, because this will give you the Ryzen plan in the power settings for Windows. The standard chipset driver won't. After the chipset driver, I tend to put the NVIDIA driver on, and the graphics driver. As you can tell, when I get back into the BIOS, I'm going to sort this fan out and probably slow it down a fraction, and probably slow the processor down a fraction, because yeah, I can't live with that noise. Okay, so after I've downloaded the graphics card driver and the motherboard drivers, I tend to download the other motherboard drivers that I need. So Wi-Fi, RAID maybe, Ryzen Master, whether you want the RGB to work on your motherboard. You can go to the Cooler Master site as well if you've got the AMD RGB cooler. The LAN drivers, Bluetooth drivers, audio driver, and anything else you've got on your motherboard. If you've got an NVMe drive, you might need to go to Samsung, for example, if it's a 960, 970, and download their software as well to make sure that your drive's working as fast as it should be, basically. A few other things I tend to download. CPU-Z I download, so make sure I've got a CPU-Z on, and also hardware monitor. And I use a combination of these programs to initially test the PC to make sure it's running the way it should be running. I also go on to a program called Night Night, and on this particular program you can go through and you can download Firefox, for example. I don't tend to download any security anymore. I used to, but I think Windows is good enough on its own nowadays, so I don't bother with any security. But you can go through and put whatever you want on through this program. I find it's quite good, it's quite quick, and it downloads quite fast. So for example, I download Steam from here, VLC from here, WinRAR from here, CutePDF from here, and various other programs that you might need. And it works quite quickly, does it all at the same time. So that's quite a good one. Right, so we've got CPU-Z and we've got hardware monitor. So just after I've downloaded these two, I'll test the actual CPU to make sure it's running within temperature. And usually I don't want it going over about 80 degrees C, so I normally max it out just using CPU-Z. So if you go onto the bench, what I normally do is I'll just run the stress test on this. I normally start with the bench to make sure it's benching the way it should be, and its representative score of what this processor should be. At the minute I've currently downclocked this processor a little bit because I'm running this processor in a mini ITX case that runs quite warm if you're not very careful. So I prefer to run it a lot slower so it doesn't get as hot and doesn't need as much power. So I don't really need all the performance at the minute. But then I'll stress the CPU and I'll be monitoring the CPU vehicle, so the amount of voltage that it's getting, the amount of voltage that it's asking for. In this case I want it to run quite quiet, so I want to make sure that the Wraith Prism cooler runs only up to about 2000 RPM max, because after 2000 RPM it gets quite loud. If I put a 120mm fan on it instead, then I'd probably run it at its default settings. So we can see now in Task Manager that the CPU is actually running 100%. This program probably doesn't max it out as much as some programs, but it's pretty good for a quick test. Right, so we can see here that the processor is all running at less than actually 1.1 volts, which is really good. We're using approximately 55 watts, which is pretty good. At standard settings, this processor probably is around 90-ish watts, somewhere around there. So we are saving quite a bit of power, and we're running the CPU now up to about 60 degrees C, which is quite cool for this processor. If you run it at standard settings on the same cooler, it tends to run up to around 75 to 80 degrees C. The other thing to do when you build a computer is to make sure all the drivers are working and nothing's missing. So if you go right click on this PC, go manage and go into device manager and make sure there's no crosses or anything against any of these things here. So against display adapters, for example, we've got NVIDIA GTX 1650 Super, so we know the graphics driver is on there and it's working. But you don't want to see any crosses down any of these things. If you do, then you need to go and find the drivers for them particular things. The other thing I tend to do is make sure, in the past I've had problems with the Microsoft account and logging in, so it's always best to set up a PIN and make sure the PIN works to log you in. Otherwise sometimes the Microsoft login can go wrong and the PIN works a lot better. What I tend to do as well is make sure that all the updates are on. So if you just click on the start button and go for updates, and it says check for updates, and then you can go in here and make sure that you're up to date, and if not you can go install now. But I'd make sure you've got the Windows probably key working first and not just the Microsoft account, because in the past I've installed updates and it's not letting me log in afterwards. So it's best just to put the PIN on before you do any updates, I believe. The other thing I tend to do is I tend to open Ryzen Master up and just make sure everything looks okay in Ryzen Master. For some reason, Hardware Monitor doesn't show you the right core speed. It doesn't downclock the way it should in Hardware Monitor, but in Ryzen it's clearly showing that the processor's clocking down or going up whenever you're playing a film or something, and it's putting certain cores to sleep, which is what it should be doing. So that all looks fine. Right, so if we come down, here I've got the DRAM voltage. So this is actually one of the settings you'll need to change. So in the XMP profile, I've put in the profile which is the DDR4 3200. However, the 1.35 volts didn't change on the board at this location, so it should be running at 1.35 volts. However, when I typed in 1.35 volts here, the actual motherboard is giving the RAM about 1.4 volts. So I've actually adjusted it a fraction. So I've come down to 1.3 volts, which is actually more like 1.35 volts, and I'll show you that in a minute. Right, so we've got some CPU settings. I've left everything else on auto. What else? We've got some advanced CPU settings here. So in here, basically, I've turned the core performance boost just to disabled to run it at 3.7 instead of, it was actually running about 4.2 just over, but I'm running the standard CPU cooler. And the problem with that is the standard CPU cooler's got plenty of performance, but it's very, very noisy when it's running at around 4.2 or 4.4. So I've slowed it down a fraction. And this computer's for one of the kids, so it's giving plenty of performance at 3.7. Right, let's just go back into easy mode. So if you look now on the easy mode, this is one of the things to look for, the memory voltage at the top. So although I've typed into the memory voltage 1.3, it's actually giving 1.344, which is pretty much what I'm after. So this is sort of running at the perfect sort of voltage. And it's one thing to you know, to double check. Right, so I'm now going to look at the fan settings. So I go into the smart fan settings. This is the CPU fan setting that I've got. It's set here to manual, and it's obviously on the CPU. The CPU at the minute is running at 45 degrees C, and these are the other temperatures that the system's recording. You can actually get the system fans to run off any of these temperatures, but I prefer to run it off a CPU. So what I've done is here, each one of these lines is 10 degrees C, so we've got 10, 20, 30, 40 degrees C, and then the fan profile starts to go up. And I think this is quite a good fan profile. Now, I don't like the fan to go up and down every 5 seconds, so what I've done is I've set it reasonably high here, so it's running at 1300 RPM or 1200 at 40 degrees C, and then it goes up to about 2000 RPM max at this 3.7, and it keeps the processor around 60 to 62 degrees, so well within its capabilities. And obviously that means the CPU is going to run cool, the system's going to run cool, but more importantly it's going to run quiet, and the system only pulls up to about 55 watts maximum at this 3.7 setting instead of 90 watts straight out the box. So if we go here and we come down to fan 1, so system fan 1 is the fan that's in the back of the PC that I got for free, if you like. And again, what I've done is I've set it so at 40 degrees C is the first point, and then it starts ramping up slightly. The rear fan set at 1144 RPM. In this Rigentech case, the rear fan's got the rear fan has got LEDs on it, so I need to run it at least about around 1000 to 1100 RPM to make the LEDs light up. Right, so we've got system fan 2. This is the Noctua fan that I've put in the top, and this is set to a lot lower. So the fan speed on this one is 694 RPM, or just under 700 RPM at this setting, and then it ramps up as the system gets hotter. This actual fan goes up to around 1700 RPM, but I don't actually run it anywhere near that speed because there's no need. It tops out around 1300 on this system when it's being fully utilised. I've also changed here on system fan 1 and 2 to run off the CPU temperature. Okay guys, thank you very much for watching.